Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much for attending today's webinar on successful management of invasive Phragmites in Georgian Bay. Today's webinar is the fifth in our series of 8 OIPC webinars, and we're covering a range of topics and themes related to invasive plant control in Ontario. Tuning in for the first time, first of all, welcome. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to mention that our next webinar will be held on Wednesday, March 8th, 2017, from until 1. It'll be led by staff from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency on their new plant protection program. And some other information can be found on the OIPC Facebook page and our website at oninvasives.ca or ontarioinvasiveplants.ca. So my name is Colin Casson, and I'm the project specialist here at the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, and I'm very pleased to be facilitating today's webinar. So keep in mind before we get started, for you with headsets, you should be all set. For those of you who'd like to switch to a telephone for audio, the toll-free number, if you have your pen and paper ready, is 1-855-797-9485, and the access code is 664-11-933. Follow the pound key, or for the younger generation, that's the hashtag on your phone. Placing the phones for everyone except myself and David on mute during the presentation and question and answer periods. So go ahead and type your questions into the Q&A box, not the box, and we'll address each of them by the end of the presentation. So I'd now take this opportunity to introduce our presenter for today. Our expert panelist, David Sweetenham, is a frag fighter extraordinaire, and he's the Executive Director of Georgian Bay Forever. David is an entrepreneur, scientist, researcher, and communicator who has spent his career in the environment and high-tech industries. He manages the GBF team to deliver results in all facets of the organization, including scientific research programs, communications and educational activities, managing the finances, fundraising, and day-to-day operations of the charity. He spent years boating and camping throughout Georgian Bay and its waterways, and worked to ensure its continued protection. So with that in mind, I'd like to thank David very much for sharing his expertise with us today, and I'm now going to turn the reins over to him. Welcome, David.
Thanks to everybody today for joining us. I'm going to talk to you today about a project that we've got focused on community engagement and the community active in the guardianship of our coastal wetlands. We started 4 years ago. We actually started to put the project plan together about 6 years ago. We received money from the Lake Simcoe Eastern Georgian Bay Cleanup Fund through what was then Environment Canada, now Environment and Climate Change Canada. I thank them for the support. This was the picture 4 years ago at the day that we received word that our application had been approved and that we could kick off our Phragmites control program. A different February than seen this year. So the long-term goal of this project is really eradication of Phragmites in Georgian Bay. This is done through training the public, community champions, municipal governments, property owners, and the public in general. Lofty goal for anybody that's been working in Phragmites. This plant can grow 18 feet tall into a solid wall of plant material, complete monoculture. Very quickly for folks, if you're not familiar with this plant, it does propagate extremely rapidly, about 2,000 seeds per head. And last week at the from research that the University of Waterloo has done, each one of those seeds could spread, and if it does, it can produce up to 41 shoots per year off of it. So the cones underground grow about 15 a year, but they can go down to, depths 8 or 9 feet even. And at the surface can grow over 4 inches a day. So here's 4 days growth, almost half a meter of growth. So an extremely aggressive invasive that outgrows our native plants. The infrastructure destruction capability of this plant is enormous. This is a picture of it growing up through an asphalt culvert at the parking lot, and right into the roadways, which cost taxpayers in direct dollars. themes, if you're going to be communicating to your public, to try to drive the awareness of the various stakeholder groups. So municipal governments are very keen on saving money on road maintenance. Show them pictures of Phragmites growing right up through a road bed. It only hits home very quickly. Or the Ministry of Transportation in the province of Ontario, who I'll talk about a little bit in a few minutes. The plant completely destroys the biodiversity, and our coastal wetlands and any wetlands are very important to the ecosystems that they serve. It's critical in managing this plant to get it early and get it out, because if it gets in there, it can actually release a poison, a gallic acid, that in the root systems of our native plants gets broken down by the enzyme tannase, producing acid. You can see lots of units of gallic acid from one molecule of gallic acid to actually inhibit their root growth and gain a competitive advantage. The plant is also very resistant to inundation. It's very resistant to flooding. Once it gets established, it actually uses a process by it can pump air down through the living shoots, in through the rhizomes and into the plant stolons and rhizomes that are out even underwater in anoxic conditions and provide enough oxygen so that respiration processes can take place. And the shoots even left standing with this plant are part of that system. And I just read a paper the other day that talked about the wind blowing across the top of the shoot acts like a venturi, and I can draw air through the entire complex of stems and rhizomes. So a very aggressive adaptation mechanism for dealing with flooding. Opportunistic, Georgian Bay, for about almost 15 years we had record low water levels, and that exposed a lot of coastal shoreline, which was perfect substrate for the opportunistic Phragmites seeds to come in and sprout. They were the first in and grew the quickest, so they just outcompeted their other native plants that would normally be found in the seed bank in those areas. Water levels started to rise, as you can see in the slide. The Phragmites that was already established was just thriving and very healthy. It didn't any adverse impacts stemmed from being inundated by water, partially because of that process that I showed you a minute ago on snorkeling. So it's important for us everywhere, but in particular in Georgian Bay, where our area of focus is, we did a project with NASA using Earth-observing satellites and looking at what nature might hold for lands along the coast. And this slide demonstrates in blue where over the coming century, as the models indicate, we may see a protracted long decline in water levels. The average or mean level gradually declining with increasing perturbations around that particular level. But you can in the north in blue, we might end up with more wetlands as the water levels drop. But in the south, which is predominantly in Bay where the development has occurred, it's about a 10.8% wetland loss, simply because of declining water levels and loss of available substrates and habitat for coastal wetlands. We know anybody that's working in the wetlands knows that development pressures are a significant threat to wetlands, and losses of wetlands are significant because of that threat. We have 10% going to be lost due to climate change impacts, and also 50% or more of our wetlands lost simply because of invasive Phragmites. That could be catastrophic to our ecosystem. Habitat that's destroyed is used by a variety of species. This is obviously a monarch butterfly, but even forest birds use the coastal margins in their migratory pathways because of their availability of habitat and food. And if those coastal wetlands are disrupted, bird populations broadly would be very, very significantly impacted. And in Georgian Bay, we have a large number of threatened or endangered species. This is a picture of a least bittern. You can see that it's attempted to make a nest in a stand of Phragmites here. Actually, in August, so it was basically the second attempt. But because these stalks are not like the cattails, which are lower and not as prone to bigs in direction due to wind, when you have an 18-foot tall stem, even if it flexes a little bit, the mechanical action on a nest structure like this is very significant, and it can collapse. So Brittany Snow from Mississauga Valley Conservation Authority took this picture when we were looking to take these Phragmites out, but we realized we had to abandon that process because of this use. So no existing predators in North America that can control the plant, unlike over in Eurasia where it came from. About 140 different types of herbivores, insects, and animals that will prevent it. So we left with few control options, and of course, we have to be very careful that we don't disrupt the other processes that are occurring in the land spaces. Spaces typically for control of Phragmites are biological, including grazing in Eurasia. Sometimes cattle, sheep, and goats are using this as a food source. In a year of cutting, we actually found a petting zoo that would take the cut material and get it to its animals, but of course weakly overwhelmed their ability to use material with the volume of material we were producing in our cuts. Processes, smart drowning, plowing, cutting, or burning, each of those may have their place. Some of them just simply help to propagate the plant. For example, adding the material cuts up the rhizomes and with a multiplicity of shoots and material each year. So it may help the contractor who's doing the plowing. It certainly doesn't help any of the adjacent property owners in the long run. And spraying, injecting, or wicking material. In the United States, chemicals are approved over water, where in Ontario we have no chemicals approved or no herbicides approved for over water application for this use at this time. So we have assessed these options and what was available to us, and certainly what was available for the community to actually engage with, and came up with the choice of actually physically cutting the material out selectively. And I'm going to talk to you a little more about that process and that we're seeing with those types of control measures. We sustain these cuts over a number of years, and this is a picture provided by the people we work with, Lynn Short. You can see that the rhizomes are simply just empty skins after a number of years, and we've completely depleted any sugars or starches out of those root systems, no longer available to the plant to grow, and therefore we can completely eliminate, simply by sustained cutting efforts, this plant from the areas that are being treated. So we have some experience and we know that this technique works. But plants are left to grow. On the left here, you can see a healthy rhizome with shoots actually starting to come out of it that's just shot out and is growing in the sand substrate, because the green materials for the plants have been left staying year over year. It's important for us to actually sustain this effort, and that, of course, presents its own challenges when you're trying to motivate your public to involve itself in a continuous guardianship type of program. Clinical application that's been done in the U.S. Certainly does work. It has an efficacy. This shows a case where just simply some stems were injected directly with I believe they used acetic acid in this case, but other herbicides or chemicals can be used. And see that the interconnectivity of the shoots, the or ribbons show stems that were actually injected, but the ground system actually conducts that toxins through the plant. And this is just a good slide to demonstrate how that interconnectivity is established. if the folks along the coastline are doing their treatments, but all of the Phragmites that you see along the roadways are allowed to stay standing, of course we'd fail. We'd be continuously and forever trying to control this. So a couple of years ago, the Ministry of Transportation in Ontario, in the western region, started to develop a plan to treat the road ditches, and selectively spraying with the glyphosate product, and actually start to try to eradicate the plant along the ditches. And this treatment has continued as it's evolved. In some places, it's just simply become spot treatments now because they are able to keep ahead of it. And although this was in response to many of the people in the agricultural community controlling the plant for their own cropping reasons, but seeing the plant grow in the ditch and then spread through under the fence and into their farm property. So the Western region has started last fall in Ontario. The Central region started to do some roadside control. And municipalities who have a large number of the actual kilometers of roads in each of these areas have also started to develop their own control methods that are all based on chemical control. But in the water, we don't have that option, Ariel, and right now we rely on our frag busting team, young and old, to fully come out and join us in the field to swiftly remove this plant from the existing wetlands. Partners on this project are wide. We started, this is a picture of David Featherstone from the Ottawa Valley Conservation Authority. And I mentioned Brittany Hope earlier. It was critical in setting up our programs in the Collingwood area and motivating our people to come out and setting up barbecues on days where we were doing our cuts. And the first year, were charged with the transport of this material over to a municipal composting facility once the community had participated in the cut. And I think together we ended up doing 25 trips with this little trailer, and the following day he came back with some other staff and did another 25 trips. We were able to recruit the community. This is a picture of some of the local people in the Collingwood area, the mayor of Collingwood under Cooper on the right. So the town staff started to be allocated towards this project. The Watershed Trust was very instrumental in helping us, and they've done a lot of work on the coastal wetlands in the Collingwood area. You can see Brittany and Dave in the center of that picture, and then some community activists who got their local populations and their condominium associations along the shore really, fired up and ramped up and ready to work on this project. Another member, George, from the Blue Mountain Watershed Trust, is in the background picture, and on the far left is me. That community involvement, direct access to some community staff, a couple of days with us the fur, and then back with their trucks and forklift tractors to actually remove material and take it to the compost facility in order for it to be properly heat treated. And community members in other areas of Georgian Bay, because some of the communities you can access only by boat, but we are able to get the cottagers, and the local contractors donated a barge. The township of Georgian Bay provided a disposal bin for us, and the again old came out to help cut and physically remove this material from the coastal wetlands. But these things occurred and needed to occur all up and down the coastline of Georgian Bay. So point up north of Perry Sound, down through Woods Bay and Cogmachine and into the Collingwood area, all were participating, made aware that each community along the coastline of Georgian Bay on a particular cutting day, that the whole community was out doing something. And so that helped us foster a sense of community that was larger than just the immediate work team that people could see in front of it. They recognized that they were part of a larger and important effort to preserve their coastline of their favorite space in the world. Wood Beach, another very sandy substrate, they use a slightly different technique because they're dealing with terrestrial based, just slightly wet feet of the frame. So they use a spading technique, which they cut into the plant just under the surface of the sand to develop the green stem material. And you see some students that have been recruited to work on the projects, and Lynn Short is leading that project, and also doing some research on the efficacy of various cutting techniques that will be sure she'll be reporting on shortly as she her results from the cuts that she did last summer. Time and frequency of those cuts will be important going forward. And here's an example of using a weed cutting device in the water. We can actually cut down in about 5 feet of water and actively remove shoot by shoot the Phragmites. In some places, of course, where monoculture, we can kind of do a sizing type of cut. But in other cases where the stalks are interspersed amongst the existing bulrushes and other types of plants, you can literally go and nip out one single stem of Phragmites. So it's slow work, it's hard work, but it's important work to do. Another part of our effort has been through work that our communications director, Heather Sargent, has been doing on our website, making materials available, looking at research and our findings, as well as some success stories. And we link everything over to the Ontario Phragmites Working Group website so that we can share that material much more broadly than our own website and our own little space can do. Also, we produce a newsletter, 3 newsletters a year, but we've done one issue that's specifically been focusing on Phragmites and what it is and why it's important to get rid of it, and that we get to talk about wetlands and all of the other garden activities. So an effort to educate our populations and our publics on the importance of wetland spaces, but also give them a project that they can undertake in cooperation with Georgian Bay and other partners to actually make a significant impact on the restoration of their coastal wetland. And that stewardship or stewardship is of critical importance to us in mustering any type of political support, governmental support for these programs as we go forward. Also created a few fun videos that we were able to transmit out through our social media. It took a fun look at it, but kind of did give people the serious information that this is a harmful plant that's working even while we sleep, grow and take over those spaces, and that it's important for folks to get engaged with and move forward on. So those materials you'll be able to find either through our website or through the Ontario Phragmites Working Group site. And I mentioned the scope of this project work, and I just wanted to kind of let you know that there's a lot of travel involved around Georgian Bay. It's a big, it's almost a Great Lake all by itself, but because we've focused on creating community champions in each of these areas, and those community champions can then kind of muster their workforces together and interface with us, we've been able to build out this program. So those materials are available again on our website if you're looking at engaging folks in your own areas. We start with basically an action plan where we want to engage the local community, and that really means they need to make the decision that they want to take on this project for the long term. We need to educate them, and we conduct forums and workshops or web-based sessions like today. And it's important to teach people how to identify this plant, because there is a native version of Phragmites that happily cooperates in its ecosystem, and simply the invasive plant that we want to remove. So teaching people how to identify the plant, what it looks like, and how to know that they have an infestation of the invasive is important. And then we go about mapping the sites, any place where we locate a shoot or a stand of Phragmites. We can do a plan, a control plan or a management plan. And the priority on that we've used has been to select the small newsstands first and give them priority, and move to the more mature established stands. In that way, we can keep the predator of the infestation controlled. Newsstands are typically easier to treat. If we can get them within 2 or 3 years before they really establish these enormous rhizome systems, we only have to cut them a couple of times and we can actually completely eliminate them from that space. The mature stands take a lot more sustained effort and just physically are much tougher plant to get rid of. In mature stands, about 60% of the material is dead material from previous years that remains standing, and getting through it to get to the living stuff is, tough work. Our program, the timing of this cut is critical, and it has to be done before the seeds are expressed. But most of the energy is out of the root system in an effort to reproduce. So it's the late July, mid-August kind of time frame when we find that most of the energy is up out of the root system and into the plant as it's trying to fluoresce, and then we can take the plant out before we have viable seeds that would blow all over the place if we were transporting the material. So that's the deal. Communities, and I'll show you a picture of this later in the year, if the seed heads are already there, you need to cut them and egg them carefully before taking the rest of the plant out. So disposal is always a concern because there's a lot of biomass to deal with here. Available municipal composting facilities that can actually get up to the temperatures that will sterilize the soils are the best possible. Although last year we had a complete fire ban in Georgian Bay because it was so dry. You can burn this material, and having to do in some places last year was simply bundle the material up and store it. And we have volunteers go back and make sure that it's not sprouting and growing again, but that it's actually drying out. With the Canadian shield, we have a lot of rock that we can put these plants on and keep them monitored very carefully. Ongoing monitoring, mapping obviously needs to be done every year because new locations can come up and sprout, and we have to plan annual cuts and keep vigilant while everybody comes together to work on this collectively. The mapping pictures I've got here is from Collingwood and Brittany. Hope this work, and you can see just small numbers, little stands, but they're diverse. It's tough to cut all of these in a day because just physically getting from place to place is difficult. But to muster up enough volunteers and assign them to specific numbers that they could go out and actually cut out 3 or 4 of the sites, or 2 or 3 depending on the size, and so we could take a good at it that way. But if you're mapping that's done through the ED maps system, there's a lot of Phragmites, and a lot of the mapping that's been done shows, like in Georgian Bay, you can see southern Georgian Bay is very, very dark red there. It's that we have the most Phragmites, it's just that we've been out mapping the most sites, so the density of mapping there is very high. As I've said, we do have a lot of it. So in a little bit, you can see the kind of disbursement, and the coastal zones here are the projects that we were working on. I'm going to scan a little bit, and you can see the kind of dispersal we've got. These little stands that occur, we're not talking about 40 or 50 hectare sites in Georgian Bay. We're talking about small sites that may be up to 10 meters across, but some are only a meter in size. But there are many, many, many of them, and that presents the management challenge that we have to contend with there. This was the mapping that we had some students do for us last year in the North Bay and South Bay area of Honey Harbor, a very popular space for cottagers and boaters. Identified 140 sites, and the red ones were sites that we couldn't finish treating. The green dots are sites that we got out to and actually treated. And the year when we didn't have these students, we were only able to get out and treat 4 sites by mustering up the community. With the community, or with the students being able to do more daily community education for us, we were able to get the community involved in 40 cuts, so a 10-fold increase in our ability to get there. And those programs are going to be carried on in 2017. We've already started to put together our postings, job postings for this year. So these students are very helpful in these programs, and they can get the word out in a cost-effective way. So if you're considering one of these programs, I'd highly recommend you consider some community champions. But north up in the Parry Sound area, these are remote outlying areas the islands are remote from a lot of cottages and certainly no roads that go out there, and yet we still have Phragmites just popping up. And that would be as a result of seeds transported in the wind and finding a habitable place. In the Franklin Islands case, the little that they're growing on there was exposed to the extreme lower levels, and it allowed the plant to get a toehold there. And the provincial parks we've been talking to also, and we're starting to get them on board with the treatment protocol. You can see that in this area here, we were able to get the community to go out and help us identify and actually cut. Sargent, our communications director, has a cottage in this area. So she's been very influential in the community, getting them engaged. But our Ontario parks are also now starting to get engaged in understanding they can do and can treat the plant also. So just building out stakeholders is critical to these projects. The Saga Valley folks created a bit of a case study for us just to look at here. I'm going to just circle, if I can bring up the pointer area. A very good circle, but I'm going to zoom into that space here in a second so you can see that we actually mapped out all of the locations and then kind of in detail created the GIS information so that we could see stands. Lower stand with the gray area is the cutting that I'm going to show you a picture of in the next slide. And you can hear that this infestation was very broadly distributed along this beachfront. Background, for anyone that's familiar with Collingwood, you'll see the Collingwood silos. But behind the Phragmites stand, the lighter green that you can see a bit of in front of the forest on the right side of this picture, the native coastal marsh. Phragmites was starting to just grow into that space and completely take over the native flora and fauna. This is a picture of during the cutting process where we actually have been able to beat it back a long way. To give you the resources required for this, we had about 25 people, I think, on this day that spent most of the day, about an 8-hour day, in the water, going back and forth, hauling out Phragmites that we were cutting, and that's the kind of impact that we were able to have. So, right people, the right numbers of people, and with the right leadership, as I mentioned, Ottawa Valley Conservation Authority, the Blue Mountain Watershed Trust, and ourselves in the town, we were able to take on what looked like very daunting and significant stands of Phragmites and actually have a direct impact on them. In fact, we were able to pull out about 8 tons of Phragmites in 2015. In 2016, I think we did almost double that collectively in all of our projects. And at the bottom in the center, somebody's hauling out these cut stalks. Again, there are no seed heads on these, so we're not about dispersing any seeds. That day was long and hard, and it took a lot of effort by a lot of people to have that impact. And here you can see basically we're right back out to the cattail marsh now, and all of the Phragmites in front of it have been removed. The water has been exposed again. That allows the coastal processes to return and a lot of the animal population to come back within a few days. Here's the site. The picture at the top on the right is the beginning picture, and there's about 1 kayak's width of access to the open water of Georgian Bay there. Phragmites was growing in and encroaching on both sides towards the hinge point, and once the Phragmites came across there, the rest of that inland space would be completely cut off from the water. The way that Phragmites transpires, it actually would dry out that area completely, and it would completely transform the coastal processes in that space. So we had to undertake to cut it. And you on the left, a couple of our community volunteers that have diligently been taking care of this location. The picture on the right is the following the one cut that we did in 2013. And already a lot of the coastal native plants are back and starting to thrive again. In 2015, we had a little bit higher water level also, which helped, but because we had that open water through the winter of 2014, 2015, the and cold processes could come in and the wave action could get in and actually clean a lot of the detritus that was left behind by the Phragmites. Here's a site up on the shield. In water, the Phragmites is growing quite healthily, and again, mustering up about 10 people at this site in about 2 hours to return it to this pristine condition. And you can see just poking up out of the water there are the native bulrushes and all of the marginal plants. And the turtles and so on can get back in and out through the coastal margins and actually use the spaces that they need. Where Phragmites are there, those spaces are completely inaccessible to those animals. And I mentioned roadways, and I mentioned the flower heads. Here you can see earlier in the year, this is late August, the community in this area wanted to do something about the stand of Phragmites along the roadway into their cottage. But the plant was already flowering, so we had to undertake to have community volunteers snip off each of the flower heads and use them with bags there. We bag them. Those bags will be left in the sun for about a year, and the decay that goes on there will break down all of any viable seeds. But we still don't dump those back into the environment. We then look at ways of disposing of them. Following this seed head removal, we were able to actually physically remove the plant stock and stage it for the disposal. We immediately are able to return those pieces back, and now animals can get through those towering walls of Phragmites that have been removed. Finally, just one of the last examples I want to show you is the water levels were extremely low in Georgian Bay. This picture is 2012. You can see the boathouse, just as a reference point there, is high and dry. But Phragmites would establish itself along these kind of sandy coastal beach areas. And water levels came up. This is the same stand, just kind of looking at a different angle at it. The Phragmites are very healthy and growing in about 5 feet of water, 4 to 5 feet of water, and all the way onto the shoreline again. So even though the water levels rebound, it doesn't adversely impact the plant once it's established. However, a work crew will impact the plant. You can see young folks and some community volunteers came out, and we were able to completely remove, again, a stand in that location. And we go back every year and inspect and remove any of the plant material that comes back in the separate process, late July, mid-August kind of time frame. And we've been very successful in keeping this plant at bay. However, I won't pretend that it's easy work. It's hard work. It's hard to get volunteers out every year. We have a lot of dedicated people that care about their environment, and they've committed to this in a long-term way. I thank the Ontario Phragmites Working Group and the OIPC, the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, for all the work they've done and the collaboration and materials that we've gathered together, and the members of the work group that we now can collaborate with and work with. And I thank the partners and donors and organizations that have given us the resources and the support to do the work in our space. So I can take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, David. I've got quite a few questions rolling in here, so we'll go ahead and address those in a second. But just as a quick reminder for anybody on the line, if you do have any further questions that you haven't typed into the Q&A box, now would be a perfect time for it. But I'm going to scroll through these questions, and if you think I'm misinterpreting your question, anybody on the line, please go ahead and feel free to re-ask it or ask it in a different way. But I'm going to do my best here to divide and conquer on these questions. So I'll also introduce Heather Sargent on the line as well, GBF's Communication Director. Heather should be live here as well.
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. So I'll go ahead and start getting through these here. So one of the questions that came in, David, I guess this is probably best for you. What type of head do you use on the brush saw, and are there any oil or lubrication requirements needed for that?
Yeah, question. So we use actually like a reciprocating edge cutter. It's the model that we use is a steel model, but it's a reciprocating type, not a rotary type. The reason for that is the rotary type is active in the water. It froths the water up, splashes a lot, but it just gets snarled up with all of the detritus. And secondly, the sawing action of the head cutter style allows us to get one stalk in one of the little gaps and snip one at a time. So I can be, the cutting people, or if I have the cutter, I can be very precise and leave other plants and just simply take it in and then gauge that one stem and then use the throttle to actually trigger the cutting motion to start. And that way do the least amount of harm to the existing plants. As far as lubrication goes, when it's in the water acts as a pretty efficient lubricator, and we've been using the same cutting head for a number of years now with no issues. But I do use a soya oil, just a Crisco soya oil from the grocery store, food grade. If there's any oils that do get in the water, then they're not going to cause any environmental damage. And when I bring the cutter out of the water and for storage, I will use some oil on it at that point in time to keep it from rusting.
And I think I've seen it on your website before, David, but just to confirm for anybody, that protocol that you guys have written up, that's available on your website, right? So if anyone wants any of the nuts and bolts and refer to a proper protocol, I guess that's a good spot to send them?
Yes, and also, I believe that the best practices guide will be updated to include the mechanical cutting protocol too. So yes, our website is a good source of that. Thanks to Heather.
So there's another question here, and maybe we can kind of all collaborate on this one, but there's a question that speaks to the idea of are there any legislative restrictions regarding the transportation of cut frag? And one of the first things that comes to mind is under the new Invasive Species Act, which, as a quick little plug, we've just posted the recording of last webinar, which was on the Invasive Species Act of Ontario. That's on our website, so if you'd like more information, check that out. But under the Invasive Species Act, there's nothing preventing the movement of Phragmites material if you're moving it for under a control program. So if you've got a managed population of frag and you're worrying about disposal and how to transport it, our understanding is that that's not an issue with regards to the Invasive Species Act. But do you have anything maybe to add to that, David?
No, it's very true. I get the thing that, we were really trying to be careful of in this project is make sure that when we cut the plant, there are no viable seeds. And that's a critical part, the timing, so that then when you are transporting it, you're not just spreading it to new locations. The restrictions, as you've described them under the new legislation, are correct. If you're doing eradication and removing the plant, then you're allowed to transport it for that purpose.
Okay. I have a question here about cutting and recutting. And the question is, how many successive cuts would it require if you were to ballpark typical mortality being achieved? So,
Good question. And it really depends if the plant is in the water or on the land. So what we find is the shoots that are out in the water, when we cut them is cutting them right down near the surface. And that allows water to actually infiltrate through the roots. And we were surprised actually by this result, that in the water we're able to get about 90% control with one cut. The stalks that are on the shoreline, however, are aided all of the time, and they come back quite robustly the second year. But by the third or fifth year, the third, we're definitely seeing a thinning. Fourth and fifth year, we're starting to really get them to the point it only takes a short amount of time to back and control them. The experience that I'd relay from Lynn Short, who I showed you a picture of earlier, cutting along the same coastline in Tiny Township, north of Wasaga Beach, is that after a control program that she's been doing on her own property, after about 5 or 6 years where she was completely socked in, she can go out in the spring and recognize the new shoots coming up from seed and pull them out and in about 20 minutes. So a year takes less and less time, but the efficacy of the cut is very good in water and a little less encouraging on the land, but still you can start to see it after a few years. Plant rhizomes, even if you had this plant in the dark, there's enough energy that this plant stores that for about a year and a half, the research has shown that it can be sending up shoots for over a year and a half if it's completely cut off light and any extra nutrients. So there's a lot of energy in the soil. And I should mention too, the program that we undertook in this kind of protocol, we built on top of research that Parks Canada started, and Preb Roy wrote a paper on this that talked about this sustained kind of cutting protocol. Mark found that because it was requiring a large amount of human resource each year, that it was very difficult to sustain that with the funding levels that they had for general maintenance. So it's still important for us as we're pushing these protocols we have to work with our other partners and stakeholders and help everybody get the resources that they need in order to participate and sustain, whether it's chemical control from the Ministry of Transportation or the chips and municipalities, or volunteers from the community groups, or parks inside of the federal and provincial parks.
To clarify one thing, it's Heather. Just so when you're in the water, you want to cut as close as you can to the sediment level, not the surface, like it's the sediment level that you want to try to get as close to as possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I also wanted to say, just from my own experience, it also depends on the size of the stand. So that's why it's so important. If you catch them early, I've had experience where nothing goes up the next year. It really kind of depends on the size of the stand.
Okay, thanks, guys. I have a question that came in here about the concerns of Phragmites and dead stands being a fire hazard. And I know we kind of hear mention of this the odd time, but in terms of concrete examples, it can be a bit challenging at times. But do you folks have any either resources in mind or any anecdotal or kind of case study examples of frag being a fire risk that come to mind?
Yeah. Go ahead.
I Google it, and there's tons of, unfortunately, examples where you'll see Phragmites on fire.
Yeah, an 18-foot tall stand of 5 hectares, which we do actually have in one space in the Honey Harbor area, adjacent to cottages and the older buildings in that area. They're all wood dry structures. If it was to catch on fire, it would present an overwhelming problem. The fire department in that area would not be able to keep ahead of it. So oftentimes to prevent that, there'll be a rolling of this plant where they'll actually bring in rollers and top over. But that mass is still there. And some spaces, it's very difficult to get into these wet spaces with equipment and machinery in order to do that rolling. And in coastal wetlands that we're working with, they're too dispersed for us to kind of get out and do that. So there's certainly fuel there. But this summer, there was a lot of fuel in all of the forests. And with fire ban and being careful, they were able to ensure they didn't have a dangerous fire occur.
I think too we've seen numerous examples in collaborative work where these tall stands sometimes cover things like fire hydrants are buried in there, stop signs, so it really becomes kind of this danger beyond just the fires. Okay.
I have a couple other questions here. one person, I'm not sure if this is better for you or Heather, but someone here is asking, how do I arrange to have an information and demonstration day to instruct some volunteers in the area of Victoria Harbour? Something that you guys could...
Yeah, absolutely. We work with the Tay Township, and Township has got a program and staff that we trained last year. They started to do some control and cuts. So a great Captain Root is a counselor in that area, and you could get a hold of her and then or hold of Heather at our location, and we can kind of arrange that.
Perfect. Email is email again?
It's Heather, spelled S-A-R, G, E as in Eric, A as in Apple, N-T, at gbf.org.
Or to me, my address is on the screen, and I can get it to Heather.
Perfect. I have a question about the nuts and bolts of your cutting procedure. What would the ideal number of volunteers, or if the ratio of cutters to removal experts be for volunteer day?
Yeah, really good question. So large cut that I showed in Collingwood there, where we had about 20 people. Some people had hand tools, where it was a little sparse, and I had one of the power hedge cutters going. So we probably had about a 5-to-1 ratio, cutter and 5 people hauling the cut material. And a lot of the work is in transporting that material from the wetland up onto the stay area on shore. So that's a great question. It helps you have some people to swap the cutting, because it does get to be exhausting by 3 or 4 hours into it.
Fair.
Yeah.
And so one of the last questions here came in about the idea of challenges with communication. So I guess this would be your ballpark. Are there any tips for reaching out to landowners who are hearing about Phragmites for the first time? So I guess any tips for reaching out to them for kind of that first point of contact?
Well, a couple of things, and I guess the question might be in terms of getting volunteers, but obviously the best thing to talk to them personally about Phragmites and perhaps leave a leaf behind. Have a couple of leaf behinds that people I could really, if you're interested in developing a community group, send some out to you. So I guess nothing replaces that, but getting local events, sometimes just having somebody come and speak at your local event is a way to reach out to local landowners. For instance, if there's a local Rotary group or et cetera, you might want to plan to have a talk of Phragmites there. In my personal area, I mean, it depends on the size of your community. I took advantage of a cocktail party and just gave a little session myself. So it really depends on your community, but I would suggest local community events, maybe tagging on as possible if you have influence there, a conversation about Phragmites and what you can do.
The other thing, and I mentioned in the presentation, we're 2 summer students in the community that they were from to go around from dock to dock. And actually, where they saw Phragmites, they would go and physically talk to the landowner, do some education, ask them if they'd be interested in participating in the cutting program. And this was before the invasive species plant or act include Phragmites, but we have a little more clout this summer with that inclusion. But most of the landowners, when they become aware of the issue, they're happy to help, or at least they're happy to allow community volunteers to come into their property and cut it out if it happens to be, borderline of 2 different properties and so on. So the students were really excellent, because we could have them out in the field for 8 weeks during the summer, every day, talking to people, handing out pamphlets and brochures, and educating the public, as well as mapping at the same time while they were out there. So it was a great, it actually worked out really well for us last summer.
Sounds like a resource and certainly a good experience for them as well. And so the last question, I think, and I hope I didn't miss any here, but the last question we have here is talking about the idea of composting and disposal. So they mentioned in the question here that the FRAG BMP, the Best Management Practices Guide that the Plant Council has put out, does not recommend composting for FRAG out of concern that the seed heads and rhizomes may spread and survive in compost. And just, David, as you mentioned there, so the Plant Council's completed our update of the BMP, and it's including some nice new information detailing your method and a few others, things like spading from Lynn. And this is one of the more substantial changes to the document itself. Just trying to provide a little bit more insight on disposal, which seems to be a bottleneck for a lot of projects. But so I guess the version is there's a new update coming, and it should be available, hopefully published and available on the website within about a month or so. But I think most of the points that you were discussing there seem to certainly be in line with exactly what we're going to be recommending. So stay tuned for more updates on that note. But that brings us, go ahead there, Heather.
Maybe the composting that's being referred to in the manual is you know, the sort of composting that you do on your own in terms of backyard, and that certainly would never work for Phragmites, right? But there are some municipalities where there are some facilities, composting temperatures, I think, reach to a degree where the seeds would be destroyed. But are very few and far between. That's my understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we see, you know, with things like garlic mustard or even knotweed removal or other invasive plants, that's only an issue. It's trying to find the right facilities to get to the right conditions to make sure that we're being helpful. So I think that brings us to the end of our questions here, guys. So I just wanted to thank both Heather and David again, and everyone else at Georgian Bay Forever for their time and interest today and sharing their expertise. We're going to be posting the recorded version of this. I know there's a few folks with some audio issues off the bat, but we're going to be posting the recorded version of this to our website within 24 hours. It's ontarioinvasiveplants.ca. And while you're there, feel free to check out a few other of our webinars. We had one last week on the Invasive Species Act. And 2 weeks from now, again on March 8th, I believe, on Wednesday, we're going to have a webinar hosted by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency talking about some of the federal projects that are to prevent new invasive plants from establishing in the province. So, Heather and David, thank you guys both very much for tuning in today, and thank you everyone on the line. We certainly appreciate your participation and look forward to our next webinar.
Yeah, buddy.